You'd think that being kind would make life easier, that showing up with patience, compassion, and emotional decency would naturally attract respect. But if you've lived long enough, you know the opposite can happen. The more grounded you become, the more others feel unsettled. The softer your tone, the sharper their reactions. And suddenly your kindness isn't seen as strength. It's taken as weakness, naivety, or worse, manipulation. But what if the real problem isn't your kindness, but what your kindness reveals? In a world that rewards noise, performance, and ego, being calm is often seen as a threat. People addicted to control, attention, or chaos don't know how to process someone who isn't playing the same game. And instead of appreciating your steady presence, they push against it, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, because they don't want to face what your behavior reflects back at them. This video is not about changing who you are. It's about understanding the emotional truth behind these reactions, why people resent calmness, why emotional detachment is misread, and why grace makes others feel exposed. If you've ever felt punished for being a good person, what you're about to hear will finally make it make sense. If this resonates with your experience, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss content that speaks to your quiet strength. And in the comments below, I want to hear your story. Have you ever been hated for simply being kind? Let's begin. 1. Choose kindness, and you'll trigger what others are hiding. You walk into a room and say nothing, but the atmosphere shifts. It's not loud, not dramatic, just an invisible tension hanging in the air. Someone glances at you, then quickly looks away. Another interrupts you mid-sentence. A third one smirks at your calm demeanor like it's something to mock. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't act superior. You were simply present, composed, kind, and clear. But even that was too much. This is the strange reality that Stoic thinkers understood long ago. Your calmness, your unshakable peace, your emotional independence, these things don't always soothe others. Sometimes they expose them. When your kindness comes from clarity rather than performance, it quietly threatens the identities built on bitterness. People who've spent years surviving through control, noise, or emotional chaos often feel uneasy around someone who no longer plays that game. You become a silent mirror, and what you reflect is not judgment, but something far more disarming: the contrast. Your calm reveals their volatility. Your grace highlights their resentment. Your detachment from validation makes their need for approval more obvious. And so they don't actually hate you. They hate what you unknowingly uncover in them. There was a man I once knew, Richard. He wasn't special in the way most people define it. He wasn't rich, he wasn't loud, and he never made people laugh just to be liked. But he had something rare: presence. He carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove, and yet his presence spoke louder than words. At every family event, his brother, always more reactive, more insecure, would jab at him. "You're too soft," he'd say, or mock the way Richard always stayed quiet in debates. The attacks weren't cruel, but they were constant. I noticed how Richard never responded, never explained himself, never flinched, and I started to understand that something deeper was playing out. The brother didn't dislike Richard's behavior. He disliked the emotional mirror Richard held up without even trying. Because Richard's peace made the brother feel exposed in his own chaos. This happens more often than we admit. A kind colleague gets sidelined for not playing into office drama. A generous friend gets dismissed as too nice because they won't gossip or compete. Even online, people who speak from grounded kindness are labeled fake, weak, or boring. But the issue isn't the behavior. It's the disturbance that behavior causes in others. You see, those who haven't confronted their own emotional wounds will often lash out at the ones who remind them those wounds are still there. And the more still you become, the louder their discomfort grows. From a Stoic view, this is the cost of true inner alignment. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That simple sentence reveals a profound truth. The moment you stop performing and start embodying real kindness, not the kind designed to please, but the kind rooted in discipline, you become a quiet force. And that force is disruptive, not because it's aggressive, but because it doesn't yield to dysfunction. People addicted to chaos often want you to engage. They want you to be reactive, to bark back, to match their energy. But when you don't, when you remain centered and unbothered, you break their cycle. You introduce a different energy, one that doesn't need to overpower because it refuses to be owned. And that refusal is what they cannot handle. It's not your fault, it's not your problem, but it is your truth. Your kindness becomes a quiet confrontation. Your emotional self-control becomes a boundary they cannot cross. And your peace, your true stoic, calm presence, becomes a kind of power that unsettles everything fake around it. 2. Stay calm under provocation and watch insecure people panic. Some people don't speak to communicate, they speak to provoke. They throw out little jabs, hide insults behind jokes, and ask questions that are really traps. You've probably seen it. The words aren't random, they're tests. What they want isn't the truth or a connection. What they want is your reaction, proof that they can pull you out of yourself and into their chaos. For people who don't feel powerful within, disturbing others becomes their form of control. And if they can get you to snap, to explain, to defend your worth, they feel relevant again. This is where calm becomes dangerous, not to you, but to them. When you stay composed under subtle attack, it disrupts their emotional playbook. They expected a spark, and you gave them stillness. That's when their strategy unravels, because they're not here to resolve conflict. They're here to confirm an illusion that they have power over others. And when your peace doesn't crack, their identity begins to. I remember a former coworker, Jordan, who tried to do this often. In meetings, he would cut me off, reframe my ideas to sound foolish, or take credit for shared work. He did it with a smile, always staying just below the surface of direct confrontation. But I never took the bait. I stuck to logic, spoke with clarity, never raised my voice. At first, he got bolder, then louder. Eventually, even people who liked him started noticing. He wasn't solving anything. He was trying to destabilize someone who refused to move. And that's the paradox of emotional discipline. To the insecure, your calm feels like a threat. Not because you said anything, but because you didn't. They expect you to mirror their emotional volatility, and when you don't, they're left alone with their discomfort. The longer you hold your ground, the more obvious it becomes that they were never in control. And that realization terrifies them. This is why the Stoics emphasized self-governance. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." What the world calls passivity, Stoicism calls sovereignty. It's the ability to remain anchored when the storm is tailored to sink you. Because in truth, those who provoke are not trying to win. They're trying not to feel powerless. And when you deny them that emotional leverage, their ego starts to spiral. You'll notice this in different places. A boss who bullies only those who react, a partner who escalates arguments just to get a response, or even a stranger who lashes out because your calm presence makes them feel irrelevant. And the pattern is always the same. When your silence doesn't bend, their noise grows desperate. Not because you're hurting them, but because you're no longer giving them a role in your emotional script. In a culture that glorifies quick reactions and emotional drama, choosing stillness can seem unnatural. But stillness is not inaction, it's control. It's saying, "I see you, but I will not be moved by you." That kind of emotional grounding isn't easy, it's earned. It takes time to build an unshakable Stoic mindset where you no longer personalize other people's instability. But once you do, you become unreadable to those who feed on reaction. And in that unreadability lies your freedom. So when you meet provocation, let your calmness speak for you. When someone pushes to test your limits, don't argue, don't perform, just remain present. Let them hear their own echo bounce back unanswered. Because real strength doesn't announce itself, it simply refuses to flinch. And that's what unsettles the insecure most. Not your defiance, but your refusal to be disturbed. 3. Give freely without expectation, and you'll awaken their need to control. There's a subtle shift that happens when kindness becomes consistent. At first, it's seen as admirable, maybe even inspiring. But over time, for some people, that same kindness stops being appreciated. It starts being expected. What once felt like a generous gesture quietly turns into a silent obligation. And when you finally set a boundary, even a gentle one, the reaction is not confusion, it's anger. Because the moment you stop giving, they don't see it as a pause, they see it as betrayal. There's a retired man on my street, Tom. Everyone knows him. He's the kind of neighbor who remembers birthdays, checks in during storms, and never leaves a fence unpainted if yours is falling apart. For years, he helped out without ever asking for anything in return, and the neighborhood loved him for it, at least at first. But that love was fragile because it wasn't built on mutual respect. It was built on unspoken convenience. One day, Tom had a routine medical appointment and couldn't help a neighbor last minute with a delivery pickup. He apologized, even offered to reschedule for another time. But she wasn't having it. Her tone changed, the warmth disappeared, and suddenly she called him selfish, cold, said things like, "After everything I've done for you," even though the truth was, she hadn't done anything for him. That's when it became clear she didn't value Tom's kindness. She depended on it, not as a gift, but as a resource. And when that resource was momentarily unavailable, she felt entitled to rage. This is the quiet cost of giving without limits. You don't just risk exhaustion, you risk being seen as a service, not a person. Stoicism teaches us to give freely, but not foolishly. To act from principle, not performance. To offer without attachment, but also to withdraw without guilt. When you build your life around helpfulness, it's easy to believe you're doing good, and often you are. But it's also easy to miss the point where generosity turns into silent pressure, where giving is no longer a choice, but a demand, and where the people around you, instead of being grateful, start building an invisible contract, one you never signed but are now expected to honor indefinitely. That's the danger. Not the act of giving itself, but the erosion of boundaries behind it. Tom didn't change. He didn't become cold. He didn't stop being kind. He simply said no once. And that single act revealed the truth. Many people were not grateful for him. They were dependent on him. And when you remove yourself from someone's dependency, they don't always feel abandoned. They feel exposed, because your presence had been covering their own inability to stand alone. That's not your failure. That's their reckoning. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Receive without pride, let go without attachment." It's a simple line, but it's a powerful reminder that the Stoic gives because it's aligned with virtue, not because he's addicted to approval. And just as importantly, he withholds when necessary, not to punish, but to preserve dignity. Your kindness is not a debt. Your presence is not a subscription, and anyone who treats it that way is not in a relationship with you. They're in a relationship with what they can take from you. This is how you reclaim your strength without losing your compassion. You don't harden, you don't withdraw completely, but you become intentional. You stop explaining, you stop apologizing. You remember that giving with no boundaries invites control disguised as gratitude. And when you say no and someone lashes out, you don't see it as a loss. You see it as clarity, because that reaction didn't destroy the relationship. It revealed it. And now you're free to protect your peace without guilt. 4. Stay quiet in loud rooms, and you'll threaten people without a word. In a culture obsessed with noise, performance, and dominance, silence is no longer seen as neutral. It's seen as disruptive. We live in rooms where the loudest voice is often mistaken for the strongest mind. But occasionally, someone walks in and says nothing. They don't try to prove anything. They don't raise their tone, flash credentials, or interrupt with witty retorts. And yet, people start reacting, not because this person offended anyone, but because they didn't join the theater. And that refusal alone can rattle a room more than any argument ever could. I once sat at a long dinner table next to a young man named Eric. He was charming, animated, and the center of every conversation. His stories had rhythm. His jokes landed well. People laughed, leaned in, and responded. At the other end of the table sat my uncle, calm, still, and observant. He didn't compete. He didn't perform. But when he did speak, the room naturally quieted. It wasn't authority he carried. It was present. The kind of presence that doesn't need validation to exist. Eric noticed it too, and hated it. He started subtly pushing, asking questions with sharp edges, correcting small details, laughing a little too loud, a little too long. His energy wasn't curiosity, it was defense, because deep down he realized something. My uncle's quiet strength couldn't be shaken, and that made his own performance feel exposed. What Eric thought was control suddenly felt fragile. That's the danger of quiet confidence. It doesn't need the room to approve. It doesn't need noise to be recognized. And for people who build their worth on external attention, that inner steadiness feels like rejection. They don't understand how someone can feel powerful without commanding attention, so they start to treat silence not as humility, but as defiance. But it's not defiance. It's emotional detachment from the applause. It's a decision to hold space rather than fill it, to watch instead of chase. And while the world may reward volume, Stoicism values restraint. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Not because we aim to be underestimated, but because we stop needing to be understood by everyone. That's the power of calmness. It doesn't beg to be seen. It simply is. And that alone disturbs those who still rely on reaction to feel real. Quiet strength is a form of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rely on validation. It doesn't conform to the social rules of who wins the room. And that kind of presence challenges the loud ego more than confrontation ever could. Because what do you do with someone you can't provoke? What do you do when your games fall flat and your exaggerations aren't echoed? You either confront your own insecurity or resent the one who didn't feed it. That resentment is real. You'll feel it in boardrooms, in group conversations, even in casual settings. A glance that lingers too long, a sarcastic remark that doesn't match the tone, an attempt to pull you into a louder rhythm. But the Stoic doesn't follow. The Stoic remains grounded, even when surrounded by noise. He knows that staying silent isn't weakness, it's a strategy. It's discipline. It's choosing self-mastery over social performance. When people can't read you, they'll try to rewrite you. They'll assign motives. They'll mislabel your quiet as arrogance, your stillness as pride, your boundaries as coldness. But none of that defines you. What defines you is your ability to remain clear when others become performative. And that clarity, unshakable, quiet, and deeply rooted, is what gives you an untouchable kind of strength. The kind that doesn't need to shout to change the atmosphere. It just walks in, and everything adjusts. 5. Refuse to play emotional games, and you'll break their manipulation cycle. Some people don't argue to solve anything. They argue to confuse, to bait, to wear you down so subtly that by the time you notice the exhaustion, you're already tangled in their web. They praise you just enough to keep you close, then withhold just enough to keep you chasing. One day you're helpful, and they admire you. The next day you set a boundary, and suddenly you're cold, distant, or selfish. You haven't changed. They have. Because in reality, this isn't a relationship, it's a system. A series of emotional transactions designed not to build trust, but to control your behavior without ever saying it directly. And the only way to win at that game is not to play. When you meet someone like this, your first instinct is to explain, to clarify that you didn't mean to upset them, to reassure them that you still care. But those responses don't create peace. They create dependence. The more you try to soothe their shifting moods, the more you teach them that your clarity is negotiable. And that's the very lesson Stoicism warns us to unlearn. Your calm, your dignity, your self-control, these aren't things to be adjusted based on someone else's instability. They are to be protected, especially when emotional manipulation enters the room. I remember a friend of mine, Mark, who worked under a supervisor with this exact pattern. The man would shower him with praise one week, then subtly undermine him the next. At first, Mark thought it was just workplace stress. He tried harder, took on more, tried to be more understanding. But the more he gave, the more the confusion grew. Until one day he stopped. He stopped reacting. He stopped explaining. He responded only with facts. He said less. He delivered more. And that shift didn't go unnoticed. The manipulative tone didn't vanish overnight, but it lost its grip. Because now the game no longer worked. The buttons were still being pushed, but Mark no longer lit up. That's the core of Stoic strength. Not detachment from emotion, but detachment from performance. When you refuse to mirror someone's emotional volatility, you force them to sit in their own discomfort. And most manipulators can't tolerate that. They need you to react so they can control the terms. But when you remain still, when your voice stays steady and your principles hold, you become unreadable. And that unreadability is terrifying to those who rely on predictable reactions to feel powerful. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who caused the injury." That's not just a call to virtue, it's a strategy for reclaiming control. Because when you stop playing the emotional tug-of-war, you remove the only leverage they ever had: your need to be understood. You let go of the urge to explain your calm, to justify your peace, or to earn their permission for your boundaries. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The manipulator starts to unravel. Not because you confronted them, but because you stopped participating. You don't need to be cruel to reclaim your clarity. You just need to be consistent. You don't need to expose their games with words. Your silence will do it for you. And that kind of silence, that still, unwavering presence, breaks more cycles than confrontation ever could. Because the game depends on your emotional investment. Without it, there is no script. No power imbalance. No cycle to continue. Just you, standing where you've always belonged, outside the performance, grounded in your own emotional discipline. So when someone tests you with backhanded praise or guilt-drenched silence, don't flinch. Don't lean in. Don't explain. Let them sit with the stillness you refuse to break. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Not to retreat, but to declare, quietly and clearly, "I don't play games. I protect peace." 6. Don't harden after pain. And you'll offend the bitter pain shapes us, but it doesn't define us unless we let it. That's the part most people avoid. Because while we all experience loss, betrayal, and disappointment, not everyone chooses the same response. Some grow wiser, calmer, more grounded. Others grow colder. They wrap their wounds in cynicism and call it maturity. They stop trusting, stop reaching, stop feeling, and they expect everyone else to follow suit. So when you walk through fire and refuse to turn bitter, when you stay kind without growing naive, your presence disturbs them. Not because you're wrong, but because you're living proof that their chosen path wasn't the only one. I remember a woman from my old neighborhood, Evelyn. She had lived through the kind of loss that would make most people shut down completely. Within 5 years, she lost her husband, her brother, and most of her physical health. But she didn't become harsh. She didn't build walls. She didn't carry her grief like a warning sign. She smiled with sincerity, asked how others were doing, and offered her time freely. She volunteered at the hospice center, not because she was trying to escape pain, but because she had made peace with it. Her kindness wasn't a performance. It came from a place beyond injury. She had chosen not to harden. There was a man at the same community center who couldn't tolerate her. He made subtle jabs, rolled his eyes when she showed empathy, dismissed her positivity as unrealistic. But beneath his sarcasm was something far more revealing than disagreement. It was resentment. Evelyn reminded him of who he could have been if he hadn't let bitterness take root. And that was a reflection he couldn't stand to see. This is what Stoicism understands with brutal clarity. That emotional detachment is not about closing the heart. It's about not letting the world break it. You don't become powerful by refusing to feel. You become powerful by refusing to be defined by those feelings. And when you walk through hardship without clinging to it, you threaten those who still use their pain as an identity. They've built a life around being hurt, around being guarded, around distrusting joy. And when someone like you comes along, who's soft but unshaken, they see everything they left behind and everything they never tried. It's not that they think you're foolish, it's that they fear you might be right. That kindness after pain might actually be possible. That forgiveness isn't weakness. That peace doesn't require isolation. And so rather than admit they could have healed, they attack the reminder that healing exists. You become the mirror they didn't ask for, but one they can't ignore. Because if your stillness is real, then their hardness isn't strength, it's avoidance. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who caused the injury." But it's not just about being different from those who hurt you. It's about refusing to let them author your character. To remain kind in a world that keeps trying to break your softness is not fragility. It's sovereignty. It means you are no longer reacting to pain, you are responding to principle. And nothing disturbs the bitter more than someone who made it through the same storm, yet didn't carry it into every room. So if your kindness offends someone, don't change. If your peace irritates those still ruled by chaos, don't shrink. You are not here to meet others at the level of their pain. You are here to live at the level of your clarity. And in doing so, you show what most are too afraid to admit, that healing is not only possible, it's a choice, one they didn't make, but you did, and that is why you stand free, not untouched by pain, but untouched by its bitterness. 7. Stay kind without needing praise, and they can't control you anymore. Real kindness doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause, validation, or applause disguised as approval. And yet, that's exactly what unsettles people the most. Not that you're generous, not that you're patient, but you don't need to be seen while doing it. Because in a world where attention has become currency, choosing to give without seeking return is the most disruptive act of all. People don't get offended by your kindness. They get offended by your freedom from their judgment. When you're no longer tied to whether they say thank you, whether they approve, or whether they even notice, they lose a form of control they've quietly held over you. I once worked with a man, Eli, who lived most of his life as the helpful one. He was the person who stayed late, who covered shifts, who remembered birthdays, and stepped in when others bailed. But underneath all that generosity was exhaustion. Not just physical, but emotional. Because Eli's kindness was never just about principle. It was about being liked. He was agreeable to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to earn the quiet currency of being needed. And slowly people learned to expect from him. Not because they respected him, but because they knew he would never say no. One day he decided to change that. He didn't announce it, he didn't grow cold. He simply began choosing. He helped when he had the capacity. He stayed silent when it wasn't his problem. He stopped explaining his absence. He let the guilt-laced questions slide by unanswered. And when someone told him he wasn't like before, he smiled. Because they were right. He wasn't. This is where true emotional detachment begins. Not in withdrawal, but in grounded clarity. When you give, not because you're afraid to disappoint, but because it aligns with your values, your energy becomes intentional. And that intention makes you powerful. It means you're no longer steering your behavior based on approval. You're no longer a servant to perception. And that's what disturbs those who once quietly dictated your actions through subtle pressure. Because if they can't steer you with compliments or manipulate you through guilt, they're left with a version of you they don't know how to control. Epictetus said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control." And one of the most uncontrollable things in life is public opinion. People will interpret your silence as arrogance, your boundaries as selfishness, your calm as detachment. But those interpretations say more about their need to define you than they do about your reality. You are never here to be readable to everyone. You are here to live in alignment with the person you've fought to become. So when someone calls you cold for no longer bending, when they say you've changed simply because you no longer explain every move, let them. If what changed is your dependence on approval, then that's not a loss. That's sovereignty. That's emotional self-respect. That's the moment you stop being a role in someone else's emotional play and become a person with your own presence, your own direction, your own pace. The moment your kindness no longer seeks to be noticed is the moment it becomes untouchable. Not because it hides, but because it's free. When you give without performance, serve without self-erasure, and show up without needing anyone to validate the effort, your power becomes permanent. That's when you stop being manipulated, not through rebellion, but through peace. Through the quiet kind of self-possession that doesn't flinch, doesn't over-explain, and doesn't chase affection. And in that stillness, you don't just reclaim your time. You reclaim yourself. Kindness, when rooted in strength and clarity, is no longer just a virtue, it becomes a form of silent power. And that power unsettles those who rely on control, attention, or emotional manipulation to feel significant. In a world driven by noise, your calmness is a rebellion. Your ability to stay kind without needing recognition threatens systems built on praise and approval. That's why kindness doesn't always bring gratitude. Sometimes it brings resistance, projection, even hostility. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your emotional stability reflects what others haven't mastered. But this is your path now, not to please, not to perform, but to live aligned with values that can't be stolen. When your actions no longer depend on how others respond, you become untouchable. Your presence becomes enough, your silence becomes strength, and your peace becomes a quiet mirror that the bitter cannot stand, but the grounded will always respect. So if you've ever felt punished for your goodness, misunderstood for your calm, or resented for your emotional detachment, this was for you. Share your story in the comments below. Someone needs to hear it. And if you found clarity here, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more grounded insights that help you protect your energy and stay unshakable.